much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the flowers, Peg. Thank you for my people who came from Grand Rapids, and thank you for the hikers for being here, even though you don't necessarily want to be. So I really appreciate it. I do have a timeline. I am a teacher. I have a handout. I do not have enough copies because I wasn't expecting so many people would be interested in this topic. So Eric mentioned the two of my subjects for her story. That is how I got involved at the History Center. I was invited, I met Eric actually through one of my former students, so there's all this kind of serendipity, right? So I met Eric, he invited me to join her story. I did that research. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed learning about local history. So the two women that he mentioned, Mary Elizabeth Peckham Morrison and Tamar Phillips Walker Moore. Why do they all have 4 names? Mary Porter Taylor also has 4 names. Mary Lewis Porter Taylor, so I just left the Lewis off. But she is the subject of today's talk. Before I get into it though, I want to thank everyone in this room who has been involved in the archives, in the collections, making all of this material organized and accessible, the new website. So let's give a hand of applause to all those hardworking archivists and the people who made it such a pleasure for me to look into this. Vern and Linda are going to be in the archives after the presentation, and they have laid out some of the materials if you want to look at them more carefully or closely. Some of the stuff that I used, almost everything is from our archives. I padded a bit with stuff that I found on the internet, but most of it is indeed from our archives. So I did the primary research, which was looking at the letters of Mary Porter Taylor. And then just added a bit to it. Also, as mentioned, if you haven't seen it yet, her story is downstairs. It's still open. It's a beautiful exhibit, and there's a lot of good information there. So Sally Winters, archivist extraordinaire, showed me this box of letters last winter when I was like, I want something else to research. So she showed me this box of letters, which is a collection of not just letters, but other memorabilia from the Porter Lewis family. And so this talk is my preliminary effort to unpack the news that Mary Porter shares with her New York family in order to provide a snapshot of a woman's life in Saugatuck during this period of rapid change, not only in the local area, but the state and in the nation. So I do have a few disclaimers. I am new to the area, as you heard. This is not my area of expertise. I don't know a lot about the history. Many of you know much more about the local history than I do. But I'm learning a lot. I'm really enjoying it. But I welcome your questions or comments as we kind of explore this topic together. So here are the letters. These letters were donated by local historian and journalist Kit Lane in 2009. In addition to the letters, and as you see if you stop by the archives afterwards, there are photographs, daguerreotypes, postcards, deeds, and a lot of other stuff that the family kind of gathered together that somehow Kit Lane acquired. And here's a note written by her that was included in this packet of stuff. These items and a lot of other things from the Lake Ridge farmhouse came to the Historical Society via channels that are best forgotten and unrecorded. So if anyone here has a clue as to how that mystery came about, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. Most of Mary's letters were transcribed by Lane and published in the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society's monthly newsletter between 2006 and 2007. And she called them letters from a pastor's wife. In an introduction to the letters, she wrote, quote, between 1872 and 1883, Mary, who was called Mary Molly Porter Taylor, wrote many letters to her sister Harriet, who was called Hattie, Porter Mills, who still lived in Penn Yan where they had all originated. Her husband, Harriet's husband, E.W. Mills, ran a dry goods store, and so they remained in Penn Yan, which is in the Finger Lakes region of New York. We don't know how many letters were exchanged over the years that the Taylors lived in Saugatuck, but the ones in our collection paint an interesting, if incomplete, portrait of Mary Taylor and her times. In the wake of the frenzy of new settlement, popularly called Michigan fever, the state grew very rapidly through the 1800s. And if you take a look at the handout, by the way, there will be a quiz, and it will include dates. I put in bold the information that's relevant to the family. And then in italics is the stuff that's the events of Saugatuck history. The stuff that's underlined is American history, so larger events of American history, and then everything else is about Michigan. So I did include just a lot of numbers of how the population of the state increased. So if you'll notice, the year that William Butler, who was the first European-American settler here, came, the population of the entire state was around 30,000. So that's pretty small, okay?
Is that white people?
That's white people, yeah. So it's important to recognize that and remember it that we are talking about the European Americans who came, not the indigenous peoples, okay? All right. And I'll refer a little bit to the timeline, but it's kind of self-explanatory. The only one that I really just wanted to perhaps at this juncture mention is that by 1860, when the Taylor family came, the population was already 750,000, so that was a big leap. And then by the end of the period that I'm kind of looking at, the population was over 2 million, so that was a lot of growth. So during this period that the historians call Michigan fever, where the population grew very rapidly, thousands of prospective settlers came from New York and New England via the Erie Canal and Lake Erie, so that was a very, kind of a standard route relatively easy for the new settlers. And among these were members of the evangelical branch of the Congregational Church, whose mission was to bring their religion to the new territories and states. And among these missionaries of the Congregational Church were Mary Ann Porter Taylor and her husband, James Franklin Taylor. Mary Ann Porter was born in Prattsburgh, New York in 1827. We don't know much about her early life, but she came from a family of prominent clergymen, and we can assume that she was devout and reasonably well educated. We know she worked as a teacher in Philadelphia for a period of time. She married James Franklin Taylor in 1858 when she was 31 years old, which is almost 10 years older than the average for a white middle-class woman in mid-19th century America. Be interesting to know why. I suspect maybe it was because James was in school, because he did get a lot of degrees. So she had to wait for him. But I don't know that for a fact. In fact, I should say, I'm going to throw in some speculation at various times. I don't really have any evidence. It's just kind of maybe makes sense, okay? After short stints in other places, the Taylors moved to Chelsea, Michigan in October of 1860 and served the first Congregational Church there for 8 years. In May of 1868, the year it was incorporated as a village, they moved to Saugatuck, which had just got the name Saugatuck at that same year. The Taylors came by horse and buggy about 150 miles from Washtenaw County in a trip that took them 4 days. The nearest railroad station was Kalamazoo, so their household goods were shipped by Michigan Central Railroad to Chicago and then by steamer to Saugatuck. Starting in 1861, Mary had 5 full-term pregnancies but only 3 children survived infancy. William and Grace, who were both born in Chelsea, and Mabel, who was born in Saugatuck. Her last full-term pregnancy was in 1870 when she was 43 years old. And for context, the child mortality rate, which includes children under the age of 5, was just over 40% in the US in the mid-1800s. So the Taylors were about average in this regard. Mary and James later adopted Anna, an orphan who worked for her board when she first came to live with the Taylors. And in her obituary it says, Anna who was treated as her own, okay? So these are the 3 Porter sisters, Mary, Belinda, and Harriet. The bulk of the correspondence consists of letters written by Mary, who always signs herself Molly. I'm going to call her Mary. Her mother's name was Mary, so that's probably why she was called Molly, and she signs herself that, but I'm going to call her Mary. And she wrote to Harriet, who she calls Hattie. I'm going to call her Harriet. And then there are also a few written to Belinda, who is known as Lily, and I'm going to call her Belinda. But I'm not going to mention her very often. There are other kinds of correspondence in the collection, but of the letters, those are the main ones. And then there were a few that James wrote to his in-laws, mostly on business matters. And what I think is really interesting here is that these are the letters that Mary wrote, not the letters she received, which would make more sense, right? Yes. So we don't know what happened to the letters she wrote. That she received, excuse me. And I don't know, they never made their way back to the farm the way the letters that she wrote did. So it would be really interesting to see both sides of the correspondence, but we only have the letters she wrote. And this is the only picture that we have of Mary. This is why the same picture shows up multiple times in the PowerPoint. This is the 3 sisters. I think this is a really beautiful portrait. I love looking at it. I was looking at it with my granddaughter yesterday, and she's like, "Grandma, look at her smile. How come she's not smiling?" And then she thought that this is Mary. She thought she was the prettiest. She thought she looked pretty sad. But I said, but look at this. She's holding hands with her sister, and that's very sweet.
It's a skinny arm, though, man.
And indeed, Lily died young at the age of 35. Okay. And Harriet, although Mary was the oldest, Harriet outlived the other 2 sisters.
Because she's happy.
She's happier, yeah. And I think that Mary looks kind of like Winona Ryder in Little Women. So this portrait of Mary as a young woman, the portrait of the older Mary revealed in her letters is more careworn. In fact, the title of this talk might more accurately be Complaints or Lamentations of a Pastor's Wife. So I think I can imagine, right? You know of what I speak, yes. Mary no doubt kept up appearances in her public persona, but in her letters home, she shares her sorrows, judgments, and weariness with her sisters. Harriet and her husband prospered and regularly made generous gifts to Mary and her family. We know they visited each other occasionally, and that Mary sent her daughter Grace to live with Harriet to continue her education. But primarily through this correspondence, Mary remained close to her family in New York despite the distance. So here are the main topics in the letters. You can see there's some overlap. And this is in no particular order. This was just me writing down stuff as I was reading through the letters. But she does talk about weather a lot, and it's not a trivial topic, right? So this is a time when weather and the seasons are really important to people's livelihood. So whether the weather is good or not is an important concern. This is a quote from Mary, "Hard work and sore trials." This could be the subtitle of the talk, because she does, again, really spend a lot of time sharing with her sisters the obstacles and troubles and trials that they face, including, not the least of the problems, is money. They don't have enough. And also the fact that this is a period of time when a lot of people get sick and die at a young age. So there's a lot of reporting of that sort of thing. Of course, church politics, her disapproval of the Episcopal Church, which was new at the time or was being built. She, of course, shares family news, and then Lake Ridge Farm, which we'll talk more about in a bit. So Mary, oops, let me stay on that one for a minute. Mary's letters include many details of hard work under difficult conditions. Women's work in the 1800s was tedious, time-consuming, and labor-intensive. In addition, on top of her church work, which included teaching Sabbath school, tending the sick, making funeral wreaths, entertaining parishioners, attending church meetings, not to mention just, the regular Sunday stuff. She also had all of her household chores, which included, and these are things that I found all of these in the letters, preparing meals for her family and the hired help, canning, baking, shopping, which sometimes involved traveling to larger places like Allegan and even Grand Rapids to buy stuff that wasn't available locally. She also sometimes asked her sister to send her stuff from New York, which I think that was mostly stuff they couldn't afford. She also had to clean her own house and the outbuildings, which she'd spend some time, it's exhausting. Laundry, without any modern appliances, of course. Planting, harvesting, churning, butchering, rug making, soap making, sewing, including making and mending clothes, and attending to the needs of her children, all with the utmost economy. Her workload left her with little time for letter writing, something that she kind of complains about in her letters. So Mary wrote, quote, "Anna was home from school so I could write my letter, do baking for the children, drive down to Saugatuck for the flour before the first bell for school, get a load of peach baskets at the factory, hurry home, assist in preparing the fruit for market, get dinner, sew on the tarletans, help load up, etc. in time for the boat. I have lived in a perfect whirl all the last year, and I sometimes wonder whether I am sane or not."
So the hired hands work outdoors.
Yeah, she did sometimes have a girl that worked in the house, but one thing that she complains about is how hard it is to keep the girls, because they get homesick or their family needs them or they get just sick, so they end up leaving.
So where were they living? They weren't living in the city or the town of Saugatuck.
I'm about to show you that. That is a good question. They lived on Butler Street. And this is what Butler Street looked like in 1865. So it looks like a typical Western frontier town. And this would be the year that the Civil War ended. Of course, they came here a couple of years after that, but it's probably not too different from what they encountered when they moved. So the parsonage for the first Congregational church was on Butler, and the church was located on Hoffman Street a few blocks away. This is the church. This is close to what it looked like when the Taylors arrived. It was the first permanent church built in Saugatuck. It started as a simple one-room wooden structure with rough-hewn pews that were heated by 2 pot-bellied stoves. At the time of the Civil War, it had 80 members, and I should say it was established in 1860. It has undergone 3 major expansions and renovations since then, but this is the church that the Taylors worked in. Mary noted that James had a nervous disposition and was not cut out for the stress of leading a new congregation through tough economic times. As early as 1867, even before they moved to Saugatuck, Mary wrote, quote, "I do not expect James will be able to preach much longer. Indeed, we can neither of us bear the nervous strain incident to this profession." But ultimately, James Taylor was one of the longest-serving ministers in the history of First Congregational. And this is what Saugatuck looked like in 1874. This shot from Mount Baldhead shows you the layout of the town 6 years after the Taylors arrived. The 2 churches are prominent. So here's First Congregational, and here's the competition. And other people here would be able to tell you more what all of this stuff is. Sally, you can ask her later. It was a small but lively place surrounded by water, where transportation and communication were slow, but where things were changing fairly quickly, consistent with the progress experienced by the nation as a whole after the Civil War. Especially after the Taylors acquired the farm southwest of Douglas in 1872, Mary often mentions how long it takes to get from one place to another. So think about, you know, the limitations of getting across or around the water, and just how slow transportation is in general at the time. And after 1874, Mary starts to spend more time at Lake Ridge Farm. And so she actually boards the children in Saugatuck, they're older at this point, during the school year, because the distance is too great for them to travel back and forth from the farm to the school. I selected 2 of Mary's letters to dig a little deeper into. So this first one is from June 3rd, 1873. So one from the summer, when she's generally in a better mood, and one from the winter, where things are a lot harder in general, okay? So this letter is typical both in tone and style, and you can see she uses every available space of the paper. It starts out like she's not planning to do that. My sister, or dear sister Hattie, and then by the time she gets to her, she has to add stuff around in the margins. In this letter, she details some of the sickness then afflicting her children and others in Saugatuck. She wrote, quote, "The town is alive with measles. The disease has not appeared here before for many years, so that all the children who are natives of this place are liable to attack." And you know, it's important for us to remember that prior to the 1960s and the readily available vaccine, measles was a highly contagious and dangerous viral disease that affected pretty much all children, okay? So the Taylor children, and it could have serious complications. So they didn't experience any long-lasting ill effects from the measles, but Mary does worry continuously about her children and the diseases that they might be subject to living in Michigan. Because it's kind of a sickly place when they first come here. So through the early years of European American settlement and even towards the end of the 19th century, Michigan was regarded as a fever-ridden, swampy area. It is estimated that prior to 1880, ague, or malaria, constituted from 50 to 75% of all sickness in Michigan. Yeah, interesting. The prevalence of malaria was an obstruction to the large-scale settlement of Michigan early in the 1800s. One rhyme of the time suggests the pervasiveness of the disease in Michigan. Quote, I don't know the tune, so I won't sing it. "Don't go to Michigan, that land of ills. The word means ague, fever, and chills." Bilious fever was another common affliction, a medical diagnosis for fever associated with vomiting, nausea, and jaundice. The most common cause was malaria. So those two are connected. The term bilious fever is now obsolete, but was used by medical practitioners in the 18th and 19th century for any fever that was thought to arise from disorders of bile, right? And so, as mentioned, Mary frequently writes about her own illness and fatigue, as well as those of her children and the hired help and the townspeople. But it did improve over time as the land was drained and deforested. In 1878, Mary wrote to Harriet, quote, "You ask at what season of the year it would be most safe for you to come west. Saugatuck has been quite free from ague for the past 2 or 3 years. The healthfulness of the place is very much improved. I think you would be safe enough in coming whenever you could best be spared from home." And just as an aside, prior to the development of germ theory in the 1850s, malaria, like other infectious diseases, was believed to be caused by molecules in the air, and malaria actually owes its name to the medieval Italian words mal-aria, which mean bad air. While many speculated that the cause of the disease was somehow associated with warm weather, that wasn't really established until the end of the 19th century by a group of Italian scientists who successfully demonstrated that mosquitoes transmitted the parasite that causes malaria. Dr. C.C. Wallin bought the tannery on the creek leading out of Goshorn Lake, north of, I guess that would have been Singapore in 1854. The Wallins put in steam power, and for nearly 30 years, the Wallin Tannery at Dingleville was the main business of C.C. Wallin and Sons, whose financial headquarters was in Chicago. Hemlock, a source of tannin, was plentiful in the surrounding area until the early 1880s. C.C. Wallin's son, Franklin, was one of the main benefactors of the Taylor family and the church. Wallin helped finance the construction of First Congregational, and his foreman at the tannery, Henry Broikman, donated half his lot on Hoffman Street for the building. Wallin's family experienced a great tragedy when his son Alfred drowned in Goshorn Lake at Christmas time in 1873. So in this letter, this is the winter letter, it's one of the longest letters in the collection. Mary's tone is particularly bleak. It's full of bad news, okay? So, dear Sister Hattie, I have retreated to the study, but have little hope of being uninterrupted for any length of time. How these intensely busy days speed on and wear our lives away. I'm so tired of the unending bustle and hurry which so much business involves. We have been passing through great trials in our little church and Sabbath school. Our Sabbath school was more reduced by sickness this summer than ever before. First came the measles into almost every family, as mentioned previously. Before the children were strong again, after recovering from this, bilious attacks prevailed, followed in some cases by that tedious, distressing disease, ague. So when the winter approached, we had much more exertion to make than we usually do to gather back the scattered members of the school. Many of the poorer ones needed assistance and clothing. The money market is very stringent here this winter, and we have been obliged to do so much more with our own hands that we are all tired in the extreme. So in addition to the disease and the stringent money market affecting the community, Mary describes the double tragedy that struck the Wallin family a few weeks prior. She wrote, Monday morning about 9 o'clock, Alfred, a very bright, manly boy, was drowned while skating. This was a crushing blow to his poor mother, Mrs. Wallin, who was already sick with heart congestion. She lingered until New Year's morn when she too passed away. And this was really heartbreaking for Mary because she was one of the women who did a lot of work for the church. So she's like really, she goes on at some length kind of mourning the loss of Mrs. Wallin. She says at the end of this long paragraph, She's left a great vacancy among us. I feel as though my human prop was gone and I cannot see the result. In addition to tanning, Mary's letters mention other activities vital to the local economy, including lumber and shipbuilding, also fruit growing and the basket factory. She was attuned to how business and weather conditions affected the townspeople and her own family's livelihood. In 1875, she wrote, "We have so much church and parish work to do this winter that I do not know where to begin. Everything is so chaotic with these stringent times. Our members are coming and going, constantly changing to seek employment." On October 8th, 1871, there were a series of simultaneous forest fires in the Great Lakes region, collectively known as the Great Midwest Fire of 1871. These fires burned several cities, towns, and villages in Michigan. Holland, Manistee, and Port Huron suffered considerable damage. And of course, the one we all know about, later that night, the Great Chicago Fire erupted and burned for 2 days. It destroyed roughly 4 square miles and killed approximately 300 people. Saugatuck provided much of the lumber needed to rebuild Chicago. Mary mentions fire relief work and also the fact that the lumbering interest prospered during this time of rebuilding after the Great Fire. Consequently, our area was deforested and the local lumber industry collapsed in 1875. The Panic of 1873 was a financial crisis that triggered an economic depression in Europe and North America that lasted from 1873 to 1877. So it was actually the worst economic depression that struck the United States before the 1930s. The causes of the economic panic in the US included inflation, speculation, especially in railroads, and major property losses in the Great Chicago Fire and also the Great Boston Fire of the preceding years. Mary wrote, quote, "Somehow we have waded through all these things and find ourselves alive, though jaded from hard work and sore trials. I have been very anxious about you all, especially about Mr. Mill's business. I hope you have not felt the depressing effects of the panic as much as we have here. In our general business relations, we are but a suburb of Chicago." And we still are. Later in this letter, she writes, if our salary was paid promptly, we should be relieved from many pecuniary embarrassments. The people do as well as they can, and we must not complain. But of course she does. Mary's January 13th letter also expresses fairly severe judgment of the new Episcopal Church. She wrote, and this is a pretty long quote, but I think it's amazing. Yes, let's hear it. "The young people here are very frivolous, caring for little else than pleasure. All this is done under the pretext of working for Christ, to raise funds for the handsome Episcopal Church, which will be occupied in about 2 weeks. They keep up one ceaseless round of promiscuous balls, masquerades, club dances, and showy dress. Late hours and general frivolity prevail. The lumbering interest on this side are mostly identified with episcopacy. James and I take a quick but firm stand against this frivolity and diversions, as these are suicidal to both health, intellect, and soul. And we are supported in our views by a part of our church. Some of our own members have rather loose convictions of duty respecting their children, and we feel that vital Christianity in this place stands in great peril, and no power but the Holy Spirit's vitalizing presence, coming down as in Pentecostal times, can save these beloved young friends from destroying themselves. The thought is agonizing in the extreme. This little church stands as a beacon in the midst of the great wilderness, and if its light be darkness, how great is that darkness? Pray for us. We feel ourselves utterly powerless for such multifarious burdens and cares. So these were dark times for Mary. Mary's language and reference to Pentecostal times are consistent with the rhetoric used by Protestant clergy during what is now called the Third Great Awakening, a period of renewed religious activism that lasted from the mid-1850s to the early 20th century. The Third Awakening was characterized by an emphasis on social issues, including abolition, women's suffrage, child labor, poverty, and the prohibition of alcohol. And all of this was kind of leading into the progressive era of the early 20th century. Now we are here at Lake Ridge Farm. So despite all these troubles, the Taylor family did have a refuge from their sore trials. Lake Ridge Farm was the name given to 46 acres the family acquired in 1872 on the lake shore southwest of Douglas. So you can't see it very well, but this is it right here. Mary describes with enthusiasm the views, the orchards, and the good air at the farm, but can't resist a few complaints. Quote, "Altogether, we should enjoy our farm life exceedingly well if we were not so disorderly and filthy." She regularly describes the improvements the Taylors made to the farm and encourages summer visits from her New York family.
Where did they get the money to buy the farm?
That is a good question. I bet they borrowed it from their family. I don't really know.
And how did they get from there to church?
That was, so that's why she started staying there more, if I understand, because, and James actually stayed in town more, because he had to be there more. But they did retire in 1877, and then they made this their primary residence. While James was still the pastor of First Congregational, the Taylor family cultivated apple, pear, and peach trees, as well as vegetables and berries on their lakeshore farm to supplement their income. In the June 3rd, 1873 letter, Mary wrote, quote, "We have set out a new apple orchard on the farm of about 50 trees, also about 50 pear trees, a few peach trees, and more than 100 grapevines. Also more than 100 poplars as a screen from the lake wind." The peaches were especially lucrative at the time, and so they planted more peach trees. Mary wrote, in 1877, "Our peach crop this year has helped us wonderfully. Prices did not rule as high as last year, but as so many of our trees bore this year for the first time, and as we have had some late peaches, our harvest was of long continuance and in the aggregate paid us well." After retirement, James became active with the West Michigan Fruit Growers Association, and his son, William Taylor, who worked on the fruit farm in his youth, became the secretary of the Michigan Fruit Growers Society and eventually the chief of bureau with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. After James died, the farm was run by his daughter Grace Taylor until 1915, and then she operated the house as a tourist lodging for a while until her death, I believe. Lake Ridge Orchards was consolidated with Bonnie View Fruit and Dairy Farm and was operated by Grace's partner Henry Jaeger under the name Taylor and Jaeger until Grace's death in 1931. The farm buildings were razed in the 1990s, and there were some other people who lived there in the interim.
But the farm was really important, full of all kinds of agricultural information. Ken Carlson Schmeeken tried to save as much as they could, but you know, there's
the house is still there, but the farm buildings were destroyed. There's a pamphlet which you can look at in the archives afterwards if you're interested that commemorates the 70th anniversary of First Congregational Church. And in the pamphlet are the documents, the speeches and letters that were read to celebrate the occasion. So one of the letters is written by William, the son. He's not present, but the letter is read by his sister Grace. So according to their son William, his parents' ministry was joint, harmonious, and joyous through the 9 years from 1868 to 1877. He continues, I take it that this was the formative period of the church. I do not know the number of members or of families represented in the church, but it was thoroughly representative of the life of the village and the country around it. The anniversary celebration pamphlet also notes the warm relationship between First Congregational and All Saints Episcopal. According to William, to leave unmentioned the cordial relations between the Congregational Church and the All Saints Episcopal Church would be an inexcusable omission, and especially the friendship which existed between their longtime rector, Reverend J. Rice Taylor, and my father, Reverend J. F. Taylor. And that was confusing to me for a long time, because they were there at the same time and they had the same name. We can safely assume that William was not aware of Mary's opinion of All Saints, at least not in those early years. So this is Mary's obituary, and consistent with the times, Mary is described first and foremost as a wife and a mother. These were the most important roles allotted to women in the 19th century. Otherwise, the main achievement noted in her obituary is that she lived to be almost 70, which is significant at a time when the average lifespan for a middle-class white woman was closer to 60. And of course, a lot of women died in childbirth. And Mary died of remittent fever, which was likely due to a chronic form of malaria. In 1896, she died in 1896 at the age of 69. James followed in 1903 at the age of 79. As expected, there is much more information available about James and his life, including a biography published in a 20th century history of Allegan County, which notes his marriage to Mary and the birth of their children, and that her death was his greatest sorrow. So we can only read between the lines of the letters Mary wrote to her sisters to get a clearer image of her life as a 19th century pioneer woman. Mary was a loyal and resourceful helpmate, protective of her husband, and apparently in sync with his views. She held strong Christian values that sometimes slipped into judgment. She worked very hard to make ends meet and also relied on the generosity of her family and community benefactors. She prioritized school attendance and made sure her children were well educated, including music lessons. She loved her lakeshore home. She delighted in her children and had a sense of humor about their foibles. She remained close to her family in distant New York, despite the limited forms of communication available to her. And I was thinking about this again yesterday when I was in my car talking to my daughter in Brazil. You know, and how we can do that, right? And how much more limited, but they still remained very close. She built strong relationships in her community with a steady eye to the future being built for her children. In one letter, Mary noted, "Pioneers live almost wholly for succeeding generations." In that regard, hers was a life fruitfully lived. In the newsletter, Kit Lane compiled the following information about Mary's children. Quote, Willie studied horticulture and was head of the plant bureau for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. before his death in 1949. Grace graduated from the Penn Yan Academy in 1884 and then the Philadelphia School of Cookery. She was later assistant principal of the Baltimore Cookery School before returning to Saugatuck to take over Lake Ridge Farm. She died July 28, 1931. Mabel was a teacher and later worked in the Civil Service Examining Division in Washington, D.C. She died of pneumonia during a visit to her sister Grace on November 5, 1930. All are buried in Riverside Cemetery. So not all Mary's children remained in Saugatuck during their lifetimes, but they all returned here for their eternal rest. And I have this one last image, just don't know who the people are. We found it in, Sally of course found it, in the book, The Wallins of Michigan. So Van Wallin is probably in here somewhere. I think this is Willie.
The head of the agriculture,
Yep, the son.
the first.
And I think this, I don't know why I think so, but I think this is Grace. It could be her, though. And I like this woman the most because she's drinking a glass of wine. Yeah, or apple juice, yeah. Yeah. So this portrait or snapshot of Mary Taylor remains incomplete, but hopefully leaves you with a fuller image of the challenges faced by women during this important time in our history. Thanks again for being here. Many thanks for the work of Kit Lane, SDHC archivist, and especially Sally Winter.